All right. Has everybody submitted homework number 9? Any more papers for that? Okay. We're going to meet on Tuesday back in the computer lab again. And probably Thursday and Sunday of next week as well, but stay tuned for those announcements. What we're going to be doing today is moving on to Chapter 9 in the textbook. We're talking about the public sector and benefit to cost analysis, and so this is something different that we should do on projects that may not always generate a positive return, but there's some larger reason to do the project. So that's sort of the essence behind Chapter 9. Here's a list of projects that are called public sector projects, and they may be financed or organized by the government for the benefit of the citizens. And if you look over the list, we all know what these are, but sometimes what's easy to lose track of is how often we use each of these in our everyday lives. If you just think about where you are right now, what you've used so far today, and how you got here, chances are good that you used a transportation system that was publicly financed and publicly developed. You probably used water today that was part of a public project. Right now I know that we're using electricity because we're in an air-conditioned room. We've got lights on. We have sewers to this building that make it possible for us to have good sanitation. We're avoiding the diseases that come from not having access to clean, pure water. We have the benefit of hospitals very close nearby, and so here's another list of more things that have to do with public sector projects. And these are all built for the benefit of people, but what they share in common is that many times they don't generate a profit. They may have revenue associated with them, but they don't necessarily make enough money to justify, if we're just looking at the expenses versus the revenues. There has to be some other factor that makes us want to do projects in some cases. We'll come back to this list later, but the purpose of these projects is to provide a service to citizens for the public good at no profit. And profit's not the same as revenue. These may have revenues, but usually the expenses or the collections at the most are just trying to cancel out the expenses associated, where there are a few of these, like airports, for example, will have passenger fees, and they may charge airlines landing fees, but all those fees are just supposed to cover the operations of the airport, and the airport isn't necessarily looking to turn a big profit. So let's compare public projects and the private projects that we've been focusing on so far to distinguish some of the differences. A private project is one where an individual or a company is trying to increase their rate of return as much as possible, whereas the public project is one where it's really for the benefit of society. Public projects are typically have a large investment, and the reason for that is that if it was a small investment, then it might be something that a private company could do on their own. These public projects are necessarily large because oftentimes there's no one else who would want to do the project, and so by default the government is doing it for the public good because either there isn't an adequate return to justify private involvement, or sometimes the private companies simply don't have enough money to kick off a project as large as these are. Another reason why they become public is because they have such a long time frame that the money in the future isn't worth as much as money now. And so it's very difficult to recoup the investment when you have a project that's going to be in service for 30 to 50 years or even beyond that. There are many bridges and dams that are well over 100 years old, and so any revenue associated with those bridges and dams so far in the future is going to be minuscule when compared to present-day expenses. The annual cash flow for a public project is such that it's not necessarily looking to make profit, although as much as possible we'd like to cover the costs of a project. Whereas that's the whole reason a private project is undertaken, is to try and maximize returns for the shareholders. Public projects have the benefit of one form of funding that isn't available to private companies, and that is taxes. And one thing that I always like to point out when we talk about taxes is that for a public agency, whether it be a state government or a city or even a national government, for them to fund a project, they have to take the money from someone else. Public entities don't have their own money. They get their money from the people that they are serving. And so a public project, when we are analyzing it to decide whether or not we should do a public project, one thing that planners should keep in their mind is this project good enough that we should take money away from other people to do it? Because it's not optional. Those other people aren't giving up their money voluntarily when it's in the form of taxes. Because public agencies like cities and governments usually are considered a better credit risk than small private companies, they're usually able to get lower interest rates. You remember earlier in the semester we looked at a table of interest rates comparing a AAA company to a company that's rated AA and single A and so on. And so public governments, because they have the ability to collect taxes, are thought of as being less risky, and so that's why they have a lower interest rate. Selection criteria is all about how do you know which project to choose when you've got multiple alternatives. And when we were comparing alternatives for private projects, the way we would know which project to select was it was the one that maximizes profit. And so we were looking at the rate of return on increment. And so ROR means it's mainly financially based, trying to maximize profits. But in a public project, they've got other considerations like the convenience that's going to be offered to people, trying to minimize the disadvantages to people who maybe are affected by a project. If you think about a highway, and if it's going through a neighborhood and is going to be taking out houses that are currently where people live, then that's a pretty serious thing. And so it's more than just looking at the dollars and cents of a project, but it's also considering the social aspects as well. And that's why where it says environment of evaluation politically inclined, there are multiple stakeholders in a public project. There's both the company that's constructing something, there will be the people who use it, there's the people who are paying for the project, and oftentimes those three groups aren't the same. So that who gets the benefits and who pays the costs and who suffers the side effects are three different groups of people, all of whom you have to juggle their interests, their competing interests. Usually the people who benefit the most from a public project, regardless of what it is, here's our list of public projects, the people who benefit the most from these projects are the people who build them. It's a construction company that's getting the most benefit out of building a new airport because they're the ones who get a huge profit from doing the project. The people who use the airport get a smaller benefit, and it's not the huge windfall that it would be for a construction company, but they have an improvement in convenience. But then think about who suffers from an airport project. Any ideas about that? When a new airport is built or when an airport is expanded, is there anyone that has a disadvantage from a project like that? The people who are living around it. Well, wouldn't that just mean it even easier for them to get to the airport? What could be the disadvantage of that? Noise. Yeah, and I know that firsthand. When I first lived in the UAE, I lived on campus facing the Sharjah airport. And back then they had a lot of cargo planes that would come in the middle of the night. And so it would be 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and it sounds like a rocket launch to Mars. It would be so noisy. And I know sometimes now there's a little bit of airport noise, but it's nothing the way like it used to be. These noisy cargo jets, I was really feeling the disbenefits of that. So one thing that's difficult is when you're keeping track of costs and benefits and disadvantages is you have to assign a dollar value to that. So what's the dollar value of getting woken up in the middle of the night from airport noise? And there are economists who study that sort of thing. One thing that gets monetized that's actually not hard to do is delay. Think about a traffic jam, and when you spend time sitting in traffic, what are the components of how that is monetized?
The amount of business that is lost.
Okay.
Because you're stuck.
Yeah, you think about what's the opportunity cost of you being there. If you weren't stuck in traffic, you might be doing something else. Maybe you'd be at work, productively engaged in your job. You might be shopping. So who's suffering there? It's the mall is suffering because you're not spending the money that you would have been spending. There's also the economic costs of when you're sitting in traffic, you're burning fuel. And so they've done studies, and I think on an average basis, when they're doing economic analysis of delay, they say it's about 35 dirhams per hour is the cost of delay. Now, I'd pay way more than 35 dirhams to get out an hour of sitting in a traffic jam, but I guess some people hate delay more than others, and there's a huge range in what people make and what they're going to be spending, but that's just an illustration of what I mean by monetize. So for us to put it into an equation, it has to be numeric. It's very difficult to say what is the numerical benefit of having a park. Let's go back to the list briefly. Children use parks, right? Kids love to go to the parks, play on the playground. And so what is the dollar value of a child playing in a park for an hour? Do you have an estimate? Yeah, but that's a subsidized price. It's annoying to pay to go to the park, but it's only, what, like about 5 dirhams to go to Mamzar Park? Yeah. You can use that as a starting point, but the value of going there is greater than that amount. Otherwise, you wouldn't go. And so you're getting more benefit of going than the 5 dirhams you pay. And that's how much you did have to pay to get there, but that doesn't represent all of the value that you have from your trip. But you've got a good point that depending on where you are, some of these things may be free, and some of them definitely aren't free. Hospitals and clinics. If you're in Canada or the UK, they have nationalized health care. And so what you pay doesn't necessarily represent the value of what you got from your visit. In the United States, hospital and health care, that's definitely not free. And so people are paying a lot for something that they could get free somewhere else. So the value of these is difficult to determine how much to monetize the effect, the benefit, the disbenefit, the cost. Water is a perfect example. We pay a lot for water here in the UAE. Well, you do. I don't pay anything for water because I live on campus. But, I mean, I've seen water bills here, and it's very expensive because it's desalinated seawater, and that's expensive to produce. Seawater is about 10 times more expensive than if you have access to groundwater. 10 times because of the fossil fuels that are required to purify it. But even though you're paying, let's say, I think the cost of a cubic meter of water is about 5 dirhams to produce, roughly. I mean, that's an order of magnitude estimate. How much is a cubic meter, which is 1,000 liters? 1,000 liters of water, how much is that really worth? And to a thirsty man in the desert, it's worth a lot more than just the 5 dirhams that it costs. And so the benefit of something and the cost of it sometimes are very different. Here are the variables we're going to be using in a couple of equations today and in future classes. We're going to come up with a ratio that tells us if a project is justified or not justified. When we put that ratio together, the first thing we're going to try and calculate is what are the advantages to the public for a project. Maybe they're saving time, or something's becoming more reliable, things are becoming more safe. There's a list of the advantages that a project can bring. In West Virginia, where I live, one of the big projects that gets done that people benefit a lot from is flood control, because it rains really hard there and it's very steep mountainous terrain, and so there are these flash floods that used to come through, and they'd kill a lot of people and cause a lot of damage. And so over the last 100 years they put in dams and flood control projects that have a huge advantage to the people that live nearby. And so that's just another example of benefits, is having those dams in place improves safety, it improves the reliability of the transportation network because it's not covered with water. It increases business revenue because companies aren't worried about having their plants flooded like they used to. So there's a huge range of benefits. Now, disbenefits are those disadvantages of the project that we talked about, where it's maybe airport noise, or if you own a company that is in an area where there's construction, then your business is going to really hurt a lot. Think about a highway construction and the road, the businesses along the highway. when the construction is happening. Does anybody here know where the Science Museum is in Sharjah? I don't know the name of the road. I went to the Science Museum a couple of weeks ago, and it was nice and quiet because the road in front of it is totally ripped up. Huge, like complete construction. It's probably like 4 kilometers of construction. We had to basically walk from another road to get to it, and we were the only people in the Science Museum. So the Science Museum isn't a business trying to turn a profit. That's, it's run by the government, so I don't think that they're too worried about it. But if it was a restaurant that's on a road that has construction, then your business is really going to be hurting while that construction is going. What about the old souk in downtown Sharjah? Has anybody been there recently? It's surrounded by a big construction wall. Like they're renovating that area. And so I've been into the old souk, and it's really quiet there as well. And those business owners are hurting a lot because of whatever construction they're doing in the area has really hurt their revenue. If you own a house and they open up a landfill near your house where garbage is buried, think about what that's going to do to the value of your home. If suddenly the government decided to start burying garbage in your backyard, it's going to reduce the value of your assets. And so that would be another example of a disbenefit. It can be reductions in quality of life, reductions in your business, anything that is a negative side effect of a project. Now costs we break up into 2 components. The initial cost, and when I say initial cost, that doesn't mean that it has to be in the present. What it usually means, the initial cost, is the amount that you spent just to construct the item. So if it's an airport that takes 5 years to build, the initial cost is how much you spent during the construction phase just to implement the project. But then the annual maintenance and operation costs are those that are ongoing over the entire lifespan of the project, having to do with maybe the utilities of the project and the salaries of the people who maintain it and so on. So when we do our comparisons, we'll probably take all of these to the same reference frame. We'll take them all to the present or the future on an annual basis to do our comparisons. But it's important to keep the initial costs and the annual maintenance and operation costs separate because there's 2 main benefit to cost formulas, and how they account for those costs are different in those 2 equations. Okay, so note 1 is just reminding that when we do these comparisons, we're going to take everything to the same basis. We're going to move all of the money from the future to the present or vice versa. The other thing here is about the minus sign. Even though we know costs are an outflow, and so in our mind the dollar value would be negative, the formulas that we use these already is taking into account that it's an outflow. And so you don't have to put in a negative sign for the amounts in the benefit to cost formulas. And then one other note is that if one of the benefits of a project is that it's going to save money, it's going to be less costly for the government in the future, then what you do, instead of counting that as a benefit, savings in cost to the government is just taken out of what costs you do have. Rather than being counted as a benefit, it's just a reduction in costs. Before I show you the formula of a benefit to cost ratio, let's talk about how these projects often get built. Some municipalities and some governments have their own construction division. In some cases, a municipality or a state highway department will have a construction division that'll be the ones that go and make a road. But oftentimes what they'll do is the government will be the one paying for the project, and they're organizing it and planning it, but then they have to partner with an outside firm to actually do the building. And when a contractor who's doing the construction doesn't share the project risk, the types of projects that we talk about for those are fixed price project, where regardless of how much it actually costs to build it, once the contractor agrees to do it for a certain amount, that's all that they get. And so that can be very risky for a contractor, because if a contractor is going against other companies, everyone is trying to make their bid as low as possible, but still make a return. They don't want their bid to be so low that they're going to lose money. So their chance to profit comes from being efficient or if you think in maybe a negative way, if they cut corners. If they're trying to do shoddy workmanship, then they can save money that way as well. And so that can be one of the disadvantages of a fixed price contract, is that the contractor has an incentive to give you as little as possible. Just as long as the inspectors will say yes, then they want to minimize what they give you. So to get around that negative disadvantage of a fixed price contract, sometimes the contractors would have what's known as a cost reimbursable project. And in cost reimbursable projects, they actually get reimbursed for the amount that they spend plus an extra amount that will go towards their profit. Cost plus. What do you suppose the negative consequence of that is? If a contractor, instead of having to do their project for just one fixed lump sum, what if the government says to them, we'll reimburse you for your expenses plus 15% additional for profit? Then they're going to maximize their expenses. Why is that?
Because they're going to get percentage.
Yeah. So their percentage profit is based on how much they spend. And so now it's the opposite problem. Before, with fixed price, the problem is they're going to spend as little as possible, and so they're going to be giving you something poor quality. With cost reimbursable, they're going to spend as much as they can because they're getting a percentage of how much they spend, not based on what they do. So they'll give you too much. So to get around those two extremes, more and more it's becoming popular to try and make the contractor a partner in the project. Rather than an outside party, if you bring them in so that they share the same risks and they share the same benefits as the people who are going to own the project, then they have an incentive to do quality work but also save money. So we'll talk about a couple of different iterations of what's known as a public-private partnership. One is a design-build project where the contractor is responsible from the beginning of the project, the planning and the design and the construction. And the advantage of doing that is, number one, that the contractor has less conflicts with who designed the project. Sometimes the engineers and the contractor can have a lot of miscommunications, and that's avoided in a design-build project because the design and the construction of the project is more closely coordinated. And that may include that the contractor is in charge of operating the project. And when they're in charge of operating the project after it's built, then they have an incentive during the construction phase to make things functional. You know, they don't want to just kick the can down the road and say, well, we don't have to make it usable. That's going to be the end owner's problem to be concerned with. And so you're building in, if they're responsible for operating, the incentive for them to build a quality project. Taking things even a step further is what's known as design, build, operate, maintain, and then finance. And that's a big thing there, the finance part. Because in a project where an outside agency is going to, in a sense, own the right to collect the revenue in the future, then how much profit they earn depends on the project being efficient and well planned and well maintained. I'll give you an example of a project that's this kind. My university, where I work in the United States, wanted a new recreation center for students. The old gym that they had was very old and worn down, and it was, when students would come to campus to visit, the number one thing that they would see was kind of low quality was the recreation center. The university didn't want to pay for a new recreation center. It was going to be a lot of money, and they just didn't have that much that they wanted to spend on a gym. And so what they did was they found a company that agreed to design the gym and build it, and they actually operate it now. And the key thing was this outside company was going to pay for the project. And so the university paid nothing out of pocket, but the company who built it gets to keep the revenue from the students, the fees that they pay every semester in order to use the gym. And so after 20 years, then that facility gets turned over to the university for free. And it's perfect because now the campus has a nice recreation center, and it didn't cost them anything. And at the end of the 20-year project, then the university gets to keep the building. Yeah?
Everything regarding this recreation center is just not under the authority of the university anymore, right?
Well, the university makes some of the regulations, but The private company operates it. The main thing that, the one big disadvantage is it's not optional. The students are required to have a membership at that recreation center. Yeah, so it's included. The university collects it along with the tuition. Yeah, yeah, is it? Yeah, so there, I think it works out to maybe 130 dirhams a month that the students are paying to use the recreation center, and you have to pay it whether you use it or not. Yeah.
This kind of project at the incentive of profit? I mean, some universities, they're non-profit, right?
Yeah, my university is a state school, and so it's non-profit.
Okay, so this means that the students are paying for people to make money.
That's right. Yeah, the company that owns that gym is making a profit. The university doesn't, but they've partnered with an agency that is making a profit. So think about on campus here. We have the outlets on campus. Burger King, right? Is there a chicken place? It used to be KFC, now it's not KFC, right?
Something similar.
Something different. So there are entities on campus that make a profit, although the university as a whole, believe it or not, you probably don't believe it, but this university is a non-profit institution. But there are people on campus who are making money. So the lines become blurred. Here's the formula. This is called the conventional benefit to cost ratio. And what we do is we have the benefits and subtract the disbenefits. Those are the disadvantages. And then in the denominator are both of the costs, the initial costs and the ongoing maintenance and operation costs. And if this benefit ratio is greater than 1, then the project is acceptable. If it's below 1, then it's unacceptable. The modified B2C ratio is a little bit different just because you subtract the maintenance and operation costs from the benefits rather than putting it into the denominator. In both cases, if you have an unacceptable project with one, you'll have an unacceptable project with the other. It's just the size of the ratio may be a little bit different. But you'll never have the case where you get yes from one and no from the other. If you have a partnership with a private company, they have the position of not being so concerned about the disbenefits. You know, the private construction company that builds an airport, for example, that private construction company isn't suffering from the extra noise. They're not suffering from delay of people who are trying to drive through a construction zone. And so sometimes we'll also, just to double check, we'll look at what's known as the profitability index. That's what PI stands for, is profitability index. And in the case of the profitability index, a company is responsible for, if they capture the benefits, and then both the maintenance and operation and the initial construction costs. So in today's in-class exercise, what you're going to be doing is, we've been using the computer a lot. I was worried that our skills of using these table lookup factors was getting a little bit rusty. So it's back to basics. We're going to go old school today and consider steps A through G. We want to find out the present worth of the initial costs, maintenance and operation, basically take everything to the present, all of the costs that are outlined, and then we'll calculate both ratios. Let's see, let me give you one additional hint before I turn you loose on that. For the annual revenue and benefits, you're going to have a two-step factor because you've got an annual series that you'll take to year 10 and then from year 10 to 0. So you'll have to actually apply two factors to that. If it helps you to visualize, feel free to draw a little cash flow diagram, but what I'd suggest is if you're going to draw a cash flow diagram, make it a separate diagram for each one of these bullet points. Don't try to put everything on the same diagram. It'll be more clear if you want to diagram it to do a separate one for each component. D, disbenefits. So the initial costs or the construction costs, even though they're not all in year 0, we move them to year 0 and find it's $72.6 million. One thing I'll point out is N is different for this P to F factor than it was for the annual series. N was 4 for the annual series, but it's 5 for that last $4 million that we have to take to the present. That's one mistake I saw a few people making last class in the earlier section. So $13.59 million for maintenance operation, benefits, $51.7 million for those. Now it's already looking kind of bad. Anytime the benefits are less than the costs, then probably this project isn't going to be so attractive when we actually put the numbers into the ratios. The conventional benefit to cost ratio is 0.414, and the modified is 0.305. I need to clarify something I said earlier. When I said that you'll get the same answer regardless of which ratio you mean, what I meant is you'll get the same yes versus no answer, not the same numeric ratio itself. So from both of these points of view, from the conventional point of view and from the modified point of view, neither of the projects look attractive. And then from the profitability index, it's not even attractive from the company's viewpoint. And the companies don't have to worry about the disbenefits. So even when you ignore the disbenefits, the profitability index isn't above 1, which it should be to be an attractive project from the point of view of the public-private partner. So this isn't a great project. But what was it again that was being built? A highway? Think about what wasn't considered. Nobody ever, the time savings. The people who live between two cities have to have a road. Maybe right now they're driving over the sand in a 4x4. So think about how much of an improvement it'll be if there's a road between these two cities. Although maybe that's not captured in the toll revenue that a road is going to collect, there might be additional benefits that this analysis hasn't considered, is the main point. What if it's someone who needs to go in an ambulance from one place to another? There's benefits to being able to get places quickly besides just, you have extra time to sip coffee once you get to the mall. It can be life or death situations sometimes. Yeah?
Shouldn't that be part of the annual revenue?
Well, not necessarily, because this is assuming that they're collecting tolls that are going to pay for it. And so, yeah, that's the actual cash. The annual revenue and benefits that it's saying here, it doesn't explicitly state it, but the intention from this example is that that was toll revenue. But my point is that sometimes there's more value to having something than just the tolls that collect it. And so that's the same point as when we were talking about the value of water. The value of water is much greater than the price you pay for the water. Yeah? Which one? Disbenefits. $16.016 million. All right. All right. Before I let you go, just a reminder that we're going to meet in the computer lab on Tuesday. So we'll be back over there, and the reason why is our analysis from here is going to look at multiple projects. And so we're going to do an incremental analysis when we get together. Please remember to put your name on your in-class exercise and set it on the chair on your way out. I'll see you on Tuesday.